Hi everyone, I'm going to cover a very serious issue here now, and it is to do with this ethos of secrecy that surrounds child abuse in Britain. And the most disturbing aspect of this is that we know that sexual crimes against children, and particularly organised sexual abuse of children, does rely absolutely totally on complete secrecy and collusion with people in authority. Sky News and The Sun would have us believe that 84% of all organised sex gangs, child sex abuser gangs in Britain, are Asian. Okay, this is in a country that we know now Edward Heath, who was Prime Minister of our nation, was abusing children, was himself sexually abusing children. Okay, we know that Margaret Thatcher covered up and protected Westminster paedophiles. She protected them and she covered up their crimes. Okay, we know that Tony Blair did the same. We know that David Cameron did the same. We know that David Cameron's senior advisor was a paedophile. Okay, so these are the facts that we know. We know that systematically there has been no justice for children in Britain. This psychosexual disease has been allowed to spread unchecked. It's run amok in our society. It's been damaging every generation. And children's crime reports have systematically been ignored, dismissed as false. And then they've set these secret family courts up to deal with the issue of child abuse, again under absolute secrecy. And they are now using a child's right to privacy as justification for giving privacy to suspects and even convicted paedophiles. Okay, now that is a very serious issue, because if you're going to give anonymity, lifelong anonymity to people who have sexually abused children, or even knowingly handed their own children over to suffer horrific sexual abuse, then basically what you are doing is you are denying publicity about this criminal, and therefore preventing them from being identified and other victims being identified. You are denying any possibility that other victims will then come forward, because the name's not been published, the face isn't published, because apparently if we publish their name and face, then their abused child can be identified, and that's a very serious risk. It's a very, very, very serious risk. So before I go on, I'm just going to play this little bit at the end here, and please listen to what he's saying.
Bias, whether unconscious or conscious, has no place in modern policing. When someone comes forward with such a serious allegation, or indeed any allegation or report, it really shouldn't matter what they look like, who they are, what their lifestyle is, what they do. What's really important is what are they saying. And it's really important that's taken seriously, and that some investigative work is done to see if there's any independent evidence to corroborate what they're saying.
Now, this morning we have had a statement from Joanne Majelik saying she feels finally vindicated by this IPCC report. She says it's been a long and difficult road. Some people may remember she was actually taken to court herself, was cleared of possession of indecent images, and she explained that actually what she was doing was compiling a case against Ian Watkins, rather more than South Wales Police were doing. And she says she is now considering legal action.
So you've just heard that little clip, okay, and what was very disturbing was that 6 people over a period of 4 years had reported Ian Watkins, Lost Prophets singer, as a very serious risk to children. And apparently those 6 people included Peaches Geldof. Well, in this news report they focus on one, which was an ex-girlfriend of Ian Watkins, who was dismissed as incredible because she was also an ex-sex worker. Okay, so apparently text messages containing explicit references to what the horrible things that Ian Watkins wanted to do to children, text messages, even photographs he'd sent to her on a laptop, they would not even look at them. Okay, they decided that that was nothing. So besides her, another 5 people, which according to guidance 2222 here, which they do produce some very good videos, which I highly rate them, and according to them, those 6 people included Peaches Geldof, which is feasible considering Peaches Geldof was quite a celebrity herself, and, you know, would have mingled in the kind of circles that pop stars mingle in, and she may have herself seen something or heard things that led her to make a crime report to police. It seems even she then wasn't deemed credible. And the other disturbing point that comes across here is how the ex-girlfriend of Ian Watkins, who reported him to police, herself ended up being prosecuted by police and even going to court for possessing indecent images of children because she was investigating Ian Watkins. So obviously Ian Watkins is receiving a level of protection there, isn't he? Because the person who's reporting him as a child abuser and presenting evidence to the police, the main witness, is being dismissed as incredible, and then later on police are going to her house to seize her computer and to arrest her because she's trying to expose Ian Watkins. Because apparently, and they're doing that to her in the guise of protecting children. So the police look at her, she's more of a risk, a woman who's reported suspicions about crimes against children. She is suddenly more of a risk. She's the one who ends up in court. Now this is happening all too often in Britain, and it's happening more and more and more and more. And people are being silenced by this system that we know is top heavy with paedophiles. I call them pedo-sado-fascists. That is what is governing Britain. That is the kind of consciousness that will impose economic terrorism on a nation and call it austerity and drive thousands of people to suicide. Okay? It is a nation that will create false flag events and then use them as justification to go and bomb innocent people in other countries for the sole purpose of establishing antiquated religious extremists, terrorists, to run those countries. These aren't conspiracy theories, okay? This is not a conspiracy. Nothing that I've just said is a conspiracy theory. It is, all of it is lawfully evidenced fact. Okay? Now the official narrative is saying the emperor is fully dressed. The factual evidence is saying he's completely naked and he's a criminal. And he worships the god of criminals. Because, you know, this apparent Luciferian cult that is being uncovered as at the heart and core of this so-called New World Order. Well, you know, what is Lucifer except a criminal? He's a criminal god for criminals who live by one law of might equals right to do as thy will. Oh, you're bigger and stronger than a little child. Oh, you can do what you like to that child, just as long as you get away with it. Make sure you've got the power to get away with it. The more power you have, the more right you have to do as thy will. And we know that organised crimes against children is not solely committed by Asian gangs. And anybody who thinks it is, really is living in cloud cuckoo land. And it is quite disturbing when you look at the Lost Prophets singer Ian Watkins. How only him and two mothers, two women who'd handed their own children over to him to be abused. I think one of them was a baby that was raped by him. Okay. Subjected children to horrific abuse. Now that's the language of the British courts. These are the courts that traditionally and commonly negate and undermine crimes against children. And even they are describing his crimes as horrific. But he must have had friends. He must have known, there must have been other people associated with him that knew what he was, that were participating in that. But apparently no, there's only 3 people. Because once one of them gets outed, it's damage limitation, isn't it? Now, he originally faced 24 separate charges, but, you know, he just pled guilty to 11 charges. So therefore he wasn't tried. So he's pled guilty to 11, so they didn't bother trying him. They just sentenced him. Can you see what's happened here? Now the Guardian, you know, covert, same manipulated media, but covertly they operate to hide the truth here. Because really that should have been the headline, is why was this guy not tried for the other 13 charges then? Alright, he pled guilty to 11. What, so then he's not tried for the other 13? No, this is damage limitation. This is a cover-up. And on this video, you know, you'll see the police apologising and different spokespeople saying, oh yes, it's terrible, that woman should have been listened to, they should have listened to his ex-partner, they shouldn't have judged her, you know, it shouldn't matter what background people come from, it shouldn't matter what class or status the suspect is, we need to protect children. Now, as I say here, there's a reference to Peaches Geldof. Apparently she was one of the people who had made allegations. The 6 people included. This report only focuses on one, and I've searched, I can't find any specific reference that on the internet that Peaches Geldof herself had reported him to police. I think it's very likely, and that is probably one of the reasons why Peaches Geldof was so incensed about the whole thing, and to discover that two mothers who'd handed over their children to Watkins knowingly for him to sexually horrifically abuse them, they are subject to lifelong anonymity to prevent the identities of their children falling into the public domain. Now what had happened was that Peaches Geldof, God rest her soul, she had found the names of these 2 women. She'd seen them on a US based website, so she assumed that their names were public already, and she published them she referred to them on her Twitter, and that then led to her being investigated and threatened with criminal charges because she'd named these 2 women, because apparently by naming these 2 women, that meant that those children's identities would also fall into the public domain, that from the women being named, then it would be easy to identify their children. And according to the CPS, anonymity for victims of sexual offences is a vital component of the criminal justice process. Is it really? I would have thought that investigating crime reports that involve children suffering sexual offences is a vital component of the criminal justice process. But you, CPS, were telling Peaches Geldof in November 2013 that you consider her naming 2 convicted criminals has put children at such risk. She needs to be immediately investigated and face criminal charges. But meanwhile, members of the public, including probably Peaches Geldof herself, according to guidance 2222. You can ignore them. You can ignore the risks that they're exposing, that they're even giving you hard evidence of explicit text messages and image sent to them over the internet. You can ignore them. Ignore the risks to children that that crime report shows. But, oh my gosh, putting the anonymity of victims at risk, that's really serious. Immediately go and start asking questions. Arrest these people. Investigate them. Seize a computer, as had happened to Lost Prophets singer Ian Watkins' ex-partner. You heard the man say it. She was in court. She actually was prosecuted by the CPS because she was investigating Ian Watkins to try and give even more evidence to the police because she was that concerned. 4 years that woman was ignored. And she feels terrible. She's left feeling terrible. She's asking herself, was there anything more she could have done? If she'd have done any more, she probably would have ended up in prison. Now, as it was, Ian Watkins only became, was discovered because a drug squad were investigating him. Obviously they had no idea about his child abuse stuff, and they were investigating. They got him, the drug squad got him, and that's when it was uncovered what he'd been doing. Now, Peaches Geldof, as I say, she had named these women, and as she said, it was on a US-based website. She thought that their names were already in the public domain, which they were then. If they were on a US website, everybody knows the names. Okay, so she shared the names, and next minute, you know, she's been visited by the police. Police yesterday underlined the seriousness of the situation. Senior Investigating Officer Detective Chief Inspector Peter Doyle of South Wales Police said, "We are aware that the names of Ian Watkins' co-defendants have been published on social media channels. Clearly, there is strong public feeling about this case, and many people are using social media forums to talk about the issues involved. Our primary objective as an organisation remains the safeguarding of vulnerable people and children." So you see, it's a very serious situation, isn't it, then? It's a much more serious situation, according to the police and the CPS, that somebody like Peaches Geldof is naming his co-defendants, because at this point they've obviously not been prosecuted. He hasn't admitted to his 11 counts. Okay. And then here we've got the delightful Janet Street Porter tweeted, "Peaches Geldof calls herself a journalist, what a joke. Blabs info which could harm innocent victims." Well, I'm sorry, Janet Street Porter. I think you need to understand that it is important that child abusers are identified, okay, so that the public can be aware of them, because they don't go to prison for life. A lot of them don't serve any prison sentence at all. And when you are protecting convicted paedophiles' identities, you are also therefore preventing other victims from coming forward or being identified. Because look at all these men. They're all named. Haven't they got children? They're hateful paedophiles. Their names have been published. Suppose some crazy people want to go and harm their children. All their children could be at risk. You've shown their abuser parents. How do we know that their own children haven't been abused? How do you know that members of their own family haven't been abused by these people and could be identified? But it's important that we see their faces, because actually they are a risk to children. The public needs to know that they're a risk to children. And other people who've had contact, who've known that children, who know children who regularly had contact with these people, can come forward and identify all the victims and say, well, you know, I saw his picture in the newspaper, and I know for a fact that the little girl who lived next door to me, you know, she was only 12. He would come in to pick her up regularly. So then go and find that person, that child. She needs help. And we can't forget that the Children's Commissioner stated, I think it was in 2013, in their report, that for every child that is identified as suffering child sexual abuse, another 7 remain unidentified. So that's 1 in 8 children. And then when you look at the crime reports about child abuse, how many of them actually get investigated, you know, you're probably coming down to figures like 5 in 20 are actually getting investigated. And when you think about the levels of corruption, like I say, this goes right up to Westminster, that they've got full control of our government, and then you look at the kind of things that these controlled ministers can do on behalf of the paedophiles, like for example Keir Starmer's credibility clause that was described as the biggest shift for a generation. Under the guidelines, prosecutors are told to focus on the credibility of allegations, not on whether victims make good witnesses. All suspects will also be investigated to see if they possess any indecent images, but not suspects who the police have decided that the crime report against them is incredible. Well, apparently, according to British authorities, Satanism is an incredible thing. It just doesn't happen. Well, we know there's no such thing as Satan, but there is such a thing as sadistic child abusers. We know there are sadists. Sadism is a component of the consciousness of this society, and it is the prime component that is operating in power right now. And we know that. We've only got to look at the damages and abuse, even against our own planet, by these people. What they do to animals. They've destroyed the Pacific Ocean with their stupid, ridiculous nuclear experiments, their nuclear power. You know, we're talking serious abuse on every level here. It all arises from the sadistic mindset. And so this, therefore, what is it doing, this credibility clause? That's what it is. It's a credibility clause. So from 2013, every organised child abuse ring in Britain can think to themselves, right, well, all we have to do is commit really extreme acts of violence and include things that when the children report it to police, it'll just seem so ridiculous. The police will legally the police can just dismiss it as incredible, and they don't need to investigate anybody. And that's exactly what they did. So that lady, the Lost Prophets ex-partner, isn't it? When she's reporting the crimes to police, they're dismissing her as incredible. As a witness, she's incredible. The children reporting very serious, horrific crimes are deemed incredible. All those children that reported crimes against Jimmy Savile, all the members of the public, all incredible. It's incredible. You know, somebody like Jimmy Savile wouldn't do things like that. But we know that he would, and we know he did. And we know that Edward Heath did now. We know that Margaret Thatcher covered things up. We know that Tony Blair did. We know that David Cameron did. We know that our courts consistently undermine, negate, they give very low sentences to these paedophiles. And, you know, it is all based on the fact that our children are described as minor human beings. Legally, and we need to get rid of that legal definition of a child, because they do then, it does go down to a child's crime report to police is a minor crime report. crimes against children are a minor concern. So then we come to Peaches Geldof, who was saying the papers must name woman A and B, because she's saying, you know, she's right. Giving them anonymity. What's that saying to the people of Britain? Parents, hey, look, if you hand your children over to be abused and you're making a profit out of it, or, you know, it gets you on the inside with some pop star, don't worry, you'll get lifelong anonymity. Nobody will ever know what you did or what threat or risk you are, and any other victims that may have suffered as a direct result of contact with yourself, they won't be able to come forward. So that actually, giving them anonymity is meaning that less victims are likely to be identified. Because don't forget, a mother with a baby, you know, and where were the dads in this? Where were them children's dads? So a woman with a baby, other women trust her. Oh, I'll look after you, little girl, for the afternoon. Oh, I'll look after your children for the weekend. But if those women don't know, because they don't know their names, because they've not been published, and yet their children have suffered abuse and they've been suffering all kinds of behavioural problems, and the mother just doesn't understand what's wrong. But if those women's faces and names were shown, then they could have said, oh my gosh, she had my child for a whole weekend, and since then my child has had this problem, that problem, that problem. I think that my children were abused while they stayed with her, but because her name has not been published, therefore nobody knows. And that means that victims are left at risk, they're left to suffer and grow up with the damages. And I know the damages, and I know how depressing this whole thing is when you open that nasty can of worms, which obviously Peaches Geldof had confronted directly. She had talked about Jimmy Savile. I think she'd even discussed Cliff Richard. She was getting to grips with the whole thing. She was very, very disturbed by it all. We know that she herself had suffered a traumatic childhood. She had problems in her teenage years with addiction, but she was a survivor. She managed to come through all that. She brought 2 beautiful children into the world. She was a devoted mother. Imagine how depressing it was for her to learn about these things, and then to herself be the one that's facing police investigations and threats of prosecution, and to be witnessing meanwhile convicted and all on behalf of protecting the identity of convicted paedophiles. Imagine. So one way or another, Peaches Geldof is a martyr. Whether she did take her own life or whether she was suicided, I would say she was driven to taking her life. So, and I know the utter despair, the depression, the disgust, the trauma and horror of it all, of just looking at the issue itself and realising the reality of it, and how many children are suffering every year. But then on top of that, to face the fact that even the very authorities that are there supposedly to protect the children are themselves involved in committing and covering up, conspiring to prosecute and harass witnesses and victims. That's abominable. I mean, she obviously knew the celebrity world was corrupt and the political world to some degree, but I think that what she had to face here left her absolutely sickened and disgusted, and I know it. And I know that it does leave you battling for the will to live. It leaves you wishing that you'd never brought a child into this world. Okay? It is a deeply, deeply distressing, disturbing thing to not only recognise the reality of what is really going on in this country, but also to witness how that the justice system will be talking about how important, it's a vital component, anonymity is a vital component of the criminal justice system. But at the same time, crime reports from the public and children can be just completely ignored and not even investigated, not even with evidence of, as in Ian Watkins' case, explicit text messages and images of children, okay, that he had possession of and sent to his ex-partner. And she took it to the police, and instead all the police can do is prosecute her. It is depressing. And for somebody who's already committed, who's already fragile, and a mother of 2 young children, and who knows what kind of threats that she was facing because of her celebrity status and because of what she was casting light on and expressing concerns over. Who knows the weight of oppression that came to bear on this beautiful young lady? You know, and this was in 28th of November 2013. By April, early April 2014, she was dead. And I say to you, Bob Geldof, if you really did love your daughter, and you really do love your grandchildren, you will recognise the validity of what I am saying here, and you will speak out about this. You will stand by your daughter. You will recognise that your daughter has been martyred to this cause, one way or another, either by her own hand or by unlawful murder. Well, by murder, unlawful killing. Either way, her death wasn't an unlawful killing, because it does have a very terrible impact. You know your daughter, you know how this would have impacted on her. And you need to speak out, because I tell you, at the moment, the silence is deafening.